Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now, let's get into it. The 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city's financial district below. At precisely 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the executive conference room hummed with the low murmur of voices and the soft clicking of laptop keyboards as senior staff prepared for what they believed would be a routine quarterly review meeting. Dr. Sofia Vasquez adjusted the strap of her modest black leather portfolio as she stepped off the elevator, her sensible flat silent against the polished marble floor. At 34, she possessed a quiet confidence that came from years of navigating corporate environments, though her appearance suggested anything but the powerhouse consultant she truly was. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a conservative navy blazer over dark slacks, professional but unremarkable attire that had been carefully chosen for this very purpose. Sofia had arrived 15 minutes early, as was her custom, giving herself time to observe the environment and the players before the meeting began. She paused near the reception area, noting the expensive artwork on the walls and the subtle displays of corporate success that decorated every surface. This was Atlas Financial Group, one of the most prestigious investment firms on the East Coast, and everything about their headquarters communicated power, wealth, and exclusivity. As she approached the conference room, Sofia could hear voices through the partially open door. The conversation was animated, filled with the kind of casual confidence that came from men who had never been questioned, never been doubted, and certainly never been challenged by someone they perceived as beneath their station. Richardson's numbers are solid, a voice was saying, authoritative and dismissive. But we need to be realistic about market projections. Some of these new consultants they're bringing in just don't understand the complexity of our operations. Sofia recognized the voice immediately from her research. Richard Wells, Senior Director of Strategic Operations, a man in his early 50s who had built his reputation on aggressive tactics and an unwavering belief in his own superiority. Wells had spent the last 15 years climbing the corporate ladder at Atlas, using a combination of political maneuvering and strategic ruthlessness that had earned him both respect and fear from his colleagues. Sofia stepped into the conference room, her entrance quiet but deliberate. The space was impressive, a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, with a wall-mounted screen displaying various financial charts and projections. 8 men in expensive suits occupied the chairs, their attention focused on the documents spread before them and the conversation at hand. Richard Wells sat at the head of the table, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, his navy suit immaculate. To his right sat Marcus Thompson, the chief financial officer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who seemed more interested in his smartphone than the meeting. David Chen, the director of client relations, occupied a chair near the windows, while several other senior executives filled the remaining seats. "Gentlemen," Sofia said quietly, her voice carrying just enough volume to draw their attention. "Good morning. I'm Sofia Vasquez from Strategic Consulting Solutions." The conversation died abruptly as 8 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Sofia had grown accustomed to this moment, the brief pause as corporate executives processed her appearance, making rapid calculations about her ethnicity, her age, her apparent level of authority, and whether she deserved their attention. Richard Wells looked up from his documents, his expression shifting from mild interest to barely concealed irritation. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, pronouncing her name with a slight hesitation that suggested he found it foreign and difficult. "I wasn't aware we had ordered any external consulting." "Marcus, did you arrange this?" Marcus Thompson glanced up from his phone, his expression blank. "Not me. Maybe David set something up." David Chen shook his head, looking equally confused. "Nothing on my calendar." "Are you sure you're in the right meeting?" Sofia remained standing, her portfolio held loosely at her side. She had anticipated this reaction and had prepared accordingly. "I believe there may be some confusion about my role here," she said calmly. I was asked to attend this quarterly review to provide insight on strategic restructuring opportunities. Wells's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her more carefully. Everything about her, from her modest clothing to her youth, suggested someone who didn't belong in this room with senior executives who controlled billions in assets. In his experience, real consultants came from prestigious firms, wore expensive suits, and carried themselves with the aggressive confidence he respected. Strategic restructuring, Wells repeated, his tone carrying a note of condescension. And who exactly requested your insight? The request came through corporate headquarters, Sofia replied, her voice steady. I was told to report here for the 9 a.m. quarterly review. Wells exchanged glances with Thompson, a silent communication that Sofia didn't miss. She could see the dismissive calculation in their expressions, the way they had already categorized her as someone who had probably made a mistake, gotten confused about her assignment, or was perhaps some junior analyst who had overstepped her bounds. Well, Wells said, settling back in his chair with the air of someone accustomed to being in control, I suppose since you're here, you might as well stay. Though I should mention that this is a senior executive meeting. We typically don't include. He paused, searching for the appropriate term, external personnel in our strategic discussions. The phrase, external personnel, hung in the air with deliberate weight. Sofia recognized it as a carefully chosen phrase designed to put her in her place without being overtly insulting. It was the kind of corporate language that maintained plausible deniability while making the speaker's true feelings perfectly clear. I appreciate the clarification, Sofia said, moving toward an empty chair at the far end of the table. I'll observe and provide input where appropriate. Wells's smile was thin and patronizing. I'm sure your observations will be interesting. Though you should understand that the decisions we make here affect hundreds of millions in assets. Our strategies are quite complex. I'm sure they are, Sofia replied, settling into her chair and opening her portfolio. She removed a leather-bound notebook and a silver pen, her movements unhurried and professional. As the meeting resumed, Sofia became a study in controlled observation. She listened carefully as Wells guided the discussion through various agenda items, quarterly performance metrics, client acquisition strategies, market positioning analysis. The conversation revealed a great deal about the dynamics in the room, the relationships between the executives, and most importantly, the fundamental flaws in their current strategic approach. Wells dominated the discussion with the confidence of someone who had never been effectively challenged. His analysis was surface level but delivered with authority, and Sofia could see that the other executives deferred to him not because his insights were particularly brilliant, but because he had established himself as the alpha in this corporate ecosystem. Our Q3 numbers show consistent growth in the healthcare and technology sectors, Wells was saying, gesturing toward the charts on the wall screen. I recommend we double down on these areas and reduce our exposure to emerging markets. Sofia made a note in her notebook, her expression neutral. From her research, she knew that Atlas's current strategy was actually quite vulnerable to market shifts, particularly in the areas Wells was advocating. Their healthcare investments were overvalued, their technology portfolio lacked diversification, and their dismissal of emerging markets showed a fundamental misunderstanding of global economic trends. The numbers look good, agreed Thompson, though Sofia suspected he hadn't actually analyzed them in any depth. Though we should consider the regulatory environment in healthcare. Some of the new legislation could impact our positions. Regulatory concerns are overblown, Wells dismissed with a wave of his hand. The market fundamentals are sound. We stick with what works. Sofia looked up from her notes. May I ask about your risk assessment models for the healthcare positions? The question created a moment of silence. Wells turned toward her with an expression that mixed surprise and irritation, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken up. Risk assessment, he repeated, his tone suggesting that her question was either obvious or irrelevant. Ms. Vasquez, we use industry-standard models. Nothing you would need to concern yourself with. I'm curious about your exposure to regulatory shifts, Sofia pressed gently. Particularly with the healthcare legislation currently moving through Congress. Have you factored potential policy changes into your projections? Wells's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The question revealed a level of knowledge that surprised him, and he didn't like surprises. In his experience, consultants who asked intelligent questions were often trouble. They complicated things, raised issues that were better left unexamined, and sometimes exposed weaknesses that were better kept hidden. Our research team handles regulatory analysis, he said curtly. We have experts for that. Of course, Sofia said, making another note. I was just wondering if the projections account for the potential 15 to 20% market correction that some analysts are predicting if the current legislation passes. The number hung in the air like a challenge. Sofia had done her homework, and she knew that Atlas's current positions would be particularly vulnerable to exactly the kind of regulatory changes that were likely to occur. More importantly, she suspected that Wells's industry-standard risk models were actually quite outdated and failed to account for several critical variables. David Chen shifted uncomfortably in his seat. 15 to 20%. That seems significant. Richard, have we looked at those numbers? Wells shot a sharp look at Chen, clearly annoyed that Sofia's question had created uncertainty among his colleagues. David, our models are solid. We don't need to chase every pessimistic prediction that comes along. I wasn't suggesting pessimism, Sofia said calmly. Just due diligence. The firms that weather major market shifts are typically the ones that prepare for multiple scenarios. Multiple scenarios, Wells repeated, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. Ms. Vasquez, with all due respect, you're speaking about strategies that require years of experience to understand properly. This isn't academic theory, this is real money, real decisions, real consequences. The dismissal was clear and deliberate. Wells was using his authority and experience as weapons, attempting to shut down a line of inquiry that was making him uncomfortable. Sofia recognized the tactic. She had seen it countless times in corporate environments where insecure leaders use condescension to avoid admitting they might be wrong. You're absolutely right, Sofia agreed. Real consequences require careful analysis. That's why I was curious about the methodology. Wells studied her for a long moment, his expression calculating. She wasn't backing down, despite his clear signals that her input wasn't welcome. In his mind, this was insubordination, a junior consultant refusing to know her place. The methodology, he said slowly, is based on 15 years of successful performance. We didn't build Atlas Financial Group by second-guessing ourselves or chasing every theoretical concern that gets raised in academic circles. The reference to academic circles was pointed and deliberate. Wells was positioning Sofia as an outsider, someone who dealt in theory rather than practice, ideas rather than results. It was a subtle but effective way of diminishing her credibility without appearing directly confrontational. Sofia nodded thoughtfully. 15 years is impressive. Though I imagine the market dynamics have changed considerably during that time. Market dynamics change, Wells said, his patience clearly wearing thin. Fundamental principles don't. Ms. Vasquez, perhaps you could share your credentials with us. Help us understand what firm you're with and what experience you bring to this discussion. The question was a trap, carefully constructed to expose Sofia as inexperienced or unqualified. Wells assumed that once he learned about her background, he could dismiss her concerns as the naive observations of someone who didn't understand how real corporate finance worked. Strategic Consulting Solutions, Sofia replied. We specialize in crisis management and organizational restructuring. Crisis management? Thompson looked up with interest. Are we expecting a crisis? Wells shot Thompson an annoyed look. No, Marcus, we're not expecting a crisis. Ms. Vasquez, I think there might be some confusion about why you're here. We're not looking for crisis management, we're reviewing quarterly performance and setting strategy for continued growth. Of course, Sofia said. Though sometimes the best time to prepare for potential challenges is when things are going well. Potential challenges, Wells repeated, his voice growing sharper. Ms. Vasquez, I'm going to be direct with you. This is a senior executive meeting. We're dealing with complex financial strategies that affect billions in assets and thousands of jobs. Your input, while I'm sure well-intentioned, isn't really appropriate for this level of discussion. The dismissal was no longer subtle. Wells was openly questioning Sofia's right to be in the room, using the weight of authority and the implicit threat of exclusion to silence her. It was a power play designed to re-establish the hierarchy and remind everyone present who was really in charge. Sofia closed her notebook and set down her pen. Around the table, the other executives watched with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a public dressing down. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared relieved that they weren't the target of Wells's displeasure. I understand your concerns, Sofia said quietly. Perhaps I should clarify my role here. Wells leaned back in his chair, satisfaction evident in his expression. He had successfully put the upstart consultant in her place, re-established his authority, and could now return to conducting the meeting without unwelcome interruptions. That would be helpful, he said, his tone suggesting that any clarification should probably begin with an apology and end with her departure. Sofia reached into her portfolio and withdrew a leather folder. From it, she removed a single sheet of letterhead and placed it on the table in front of her. The Atlas Financial Group logo was clearly visible at the top, along with text that was too small for the others to read from their positions. Mr. Wells, she said, her voice carrying a new quality, not louder, but somehow more substantial, I think there may indeed be some confusion about my role here. Wells glanced at the document, his expression still confident. Ms. Vasquez, whatever paperwork you have, I think. The confusion, Sofia continued, seems to be about who requested my presence at this meeting. She slid the document across the table toward Wells. As his eyes focused on the text, his expression began to change. The confidence faded first, replaced by confusion, then by something approaching alarm. The letterhead was genuine Atlas Financial Group stationery. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably that of Jonathan Atlas, the CEO and founder of the company. But it was the text between the letterhead and signature that caused Wells's face to drain of color. What is this?" he asked, his voice suddenly uncertain. "A letter of introduction," Sofia said calmly. "From Mr. Atlas to his senior staff, announcing my role as lead strategic consultant for the comprehensive organizational review he commissioned 3 months ago." The silence in the room was absolute. Thompson leaned forward, trying to read the document from his position. Chen had stopped looking at his phone entirely. The other executives sat frozen, sensing that something significant was happening but not yet understanding what. Wells read the letter again, his mind struggling to process the information. The document was genuine, he recognized Atlas's letterhead, his signature, even his characteristic language patterns. But the content made no sense with what had just transpired. "This says..." Wells began, then stopped, reading again. "This says you're heading a complete strategic review of all operations." "That's correct," Sofia confirmed. "With particular focus on risk management, organizational efficiency, and leadership effectiveness." "Leadership effectiveness," Thompson repeated, the implications beginning to dawn on him. Sofia retrieved another document from her folder. Mr. Atlas was quite specific about the scope of the review. He wanted an assessment of how well the senior leadership team handles unexpected challenges, responds to new information, and treats colleagues at all levels of the organization. Wells stared at the documents, his mind racing. "You're saying, this entire meeting, you were evaluating us?" "Not the entire meeting," Sofia clarified. "The evaluation began the moment I walked into this room. Mr. Atlas was particularly interested in how the leadership team would respond to input from someone they perceived as having less authority." The implications crashed over Wells like a wave. Every dismissive comment, every condescending tone, every attempt to silence her input, all of it had been observed, noted, and would be reported directly to the CEO. He had been so focused on maintaining his authority that he had completely missed the fact that his authority was being evaluated. "I don't understand," Chen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why the deception?" Why not just announce who you were? Sofia turned toward him, her expression neutral but not unkind. Because Mr. Atlas wanted to see how the leadership team operates when they believe they hold all the power. He was concerned about reports of a hierarchical culture that might be inhibiting innovation and collaborative decision-making. Thompson let out a low whistle. Reports of hierarchical culture. Jesus. Wells was staring at the documents as if they might change if he looked at them long enough. This entire setup, the confusion about your role, the questions about our strategies, it was all planned. The questions about your strategies were based on genuine concerns, Sofia replied. The healthcare legislation I mentioned. It's likely to pass within the next 6 months. The regulatory changes will almost certainly impact your current positions. Those weren't hypothetical scenarios, they were real risks that your current models aren't accounting for. And you know this because? Wells asked, though he seemed to already suspect the answer. Sofia removed one final document from her folder, her own credentials and background summary. Because in addition to my consulting work, I spent 8 years as a senior analyst with the Federal Reserve, specializing in regulatory impact assessment. Before that, I was a policy advisor to 3 different congressional subcommittees dealing with financial services regulation. The credentials were impressive enough to command respect from anyone in the financial industry. Wells found himself looking at Sofia with completely different eyes, seeing for the first time not a junior consultant who had stumbled into the wrong meeting, but a highly qualified expert whose questions had exposed serious gaps in their strategic planning. The Federal Reserve, Thompson said, awe creeping into his voice. That's serious credentials. It is, Sofia agreed. Which is why Mr. Atlas requested my services. He's aware that the financial landscape is changing rapidly, and he wanted an outside perspective on whether Atlas was positioned to handle those changes effectively. Wells was struggling to process the complete reversal of the situation. So when you asked about our risk models, I was genuinely curious about your methodology, Sofia said. Based on my experience, I suspected you might be using outdated approaches that don't account for current regulatory trends. Your responses confirmed those suspicions. And when I dismissed your concerns about healthcare legislation, you demonstrated exactly the kind of inflexibility that Mr. Atlas was worried about. The legislation isn't a theoretical possibility, it's currently being debated in committee, and the current version would have significant impact on firms with your level of healthcare exposure. Chen leaned forward, his expression troubled. How significant? Sofia consulted her notes. Based on preliminary analysis, firms with Atlas's current healthcare portfolio could see 12 to 18% corrections in those positions if the legislation passes in its current form. The impact would be felt within 60 to 90 days of implementation. The room fell silent as the executives absorbed this information. Wells looked particularly shaken, realizing that his dismissal of Sofia's concerns had been not just rude, but potentially costly to the firm. 18%, Thompson whispered. On our healthcare positions, that's approximately $2.3 billion in potential losses, Sofia completed. Though there are strategies to mitigate that exposure if you act quickly. Wells looked up at her, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. You have mitigation strategies? Several, Sofia confirmed. But implementing them would require acknowledging that the current approach has weaknesses and being willing to consider alternative perspectives. The pointed nature of her comment wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Wells had spent the first part of the meeting dismissing alternative perspectives and defending the current approach, demonstrating exactly the kind of rigid thinking that could cost the firm billions. Ms. Vasquez, Wells said, his voice much quieter than before, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your background and expertise that were completely inappropriate. Sofia nodded graciously. Apology accepted, Mr. Wells. Though I should point out that the assumptions you made weren't really about my background, they were about my apparent authority level. You dismissed my input because you assumed I didn't have the right to offer it. The observation cut to the heart of the issue. Wells realized that he had created a hostile environment for anyone who didn't fit his preconceived notions of what authority looked like. If Sofia had been a young white man with identical credentials, would he have responded the same way? If she had been wearing a more expensive suit, or if her name had been Smith instead of Vasquez, would his behavior have been different? "You're right," Wells admitted, the words clearly difficult for him. "I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment. That's not acceptable in a leadership position." Sofia studied him for a moment, noting the genuine discomfort in his expression. "Mr. Wells, one of the things Mr. Atlas wanted me to assess was whether the leadership team was capable of learning from feedback and adapting their approach when presented with new information. Your response right now is part of that assessment." Wells nodded slowly. "And what would you recommend based on what you've observed?" "That depends," Sofia said. "Are you asking because you want to know what to tell Mr. Atlas, or because you genuinely want to improve how this team operates?" The question hung in the air, forcing Wells to confront his own motivations. Was he trying to salvage his reputation, or was he actually committed to change? "Both," he said finally. "I want to do better, but I also need to understand what kind of report you'll be giving to Mr. Atlas." Sofia appreciated the honesty. "My report will document what happened here today, including both the initial response to my presence and this conversation. Mr. Atlas will draw his own conclusions about what it means for the leadership team." "And the strategic issues?" Chen asked. "The regulatory risks and portfolio vulnerabilities? Those are separate from the leadership assessment," Sofia replied. "Mr. Atlas hired me to provide strategic recommendations regardless of how the leadership evaluation turned out. The firm has real exposure that needs to be addressed." Thompson leaned back in his chair, the full scope of the situation becoming clear. "So we're dealing with both a leadership crisis and a potential financial crisis." "The financial issues are manageable if addressed promptly," Sofia said. "The leadership issues are more complex, but also more important in the long term." Wells looked around the table at his colleagues, seeing them with new eyes. How often had he dismissed input from people he perceived as having less authority? How many good ideas had been lost because someone didn't have the right title, the right background, or the right appearance? "Ms. Vasquez," Wells said, "what would you recommend as next steps?" Sofia opened her notebook again, consulting her notes. "For the immediate financial concerns, I'd recommend implementing a diversification strategy for your healthcare positions within the next 30 days. I can provide specific recommendations for alternative investments that would maintain your target returns while reducing regulatory exposure." "And for the leadership issues?" "That's more complex," Sofia admitted. "Cultural change takes time and sustained effort. But it starts with acknowledging that good ideas can come from anywhere, and that dismissing input based on assumptions about the source is not just unfair, it's bad business." Wells nodded slowly. "I can see that now. What I can't see is how to ensure it doesn't happen again." Sofia considered this. "Mr. Atlas mentioned that he's been receiving feedback about the organizational culture here for some time. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern." "A pattern of what?" "Hierarchical thinking that prioritizes appearance over substance, authority over expertise, and conformity over innovation. It's not uncommon in financial firms, but it is costly." Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Costly how?" "In missed opportunities, poor decision-making, and talent retention," Sofia replied. "When people know their input won't be valued unless they fit a certain profile, they stop offering input. You lose the benefit of diverse perspectives and alternative approaches. And diverse perspectives matter because..." Chen asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand. "Because markets are complex, regulations are constantly changing, and the strategies that worked yesterday might not work tomorrow," Sofia explained. "Firms that adapt quickly to new conditions outperform those that rely on historical approaches." Wells was beginning to grasp the full scope of what had transpired. "So when I dismissed your regulatory concerns, I wasn't just being rude, I was demonstrating exactly the kind of inflexibility that could cost us millions." Potentially billions, Sofia corrected. But the good news is that these are correctable problems if leadership is committed to change. What kind of change? Wells asked. Sofia closed her notebook and looked around the table, making eye contact with each executive. The kind that requires examining your own assumptions, questioning your own biases, and being willing to listen to people who might know something you don't, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. The message was clear, and it landed with the weight of truth. Wells realized that his behavior towards Sofia had been a perfect microcosm of the larger cultural problems at Atlas Financial Group. He had been so invested in maintaining his authority that he had nearly missed critical information about the firm's strategic vulnerabilities. Ms. Vasquez, Wells said, his voice carrying a new note of respect, I'd like to hear your specific recommendations, both for the portfolio issues and for the cultural changes. Sofia smiled for the first time since entering the room. I think that would be a very productive use of our time. As the meeting continued, the dynamic in the room shifted completely. Wells found himself listening carefully to Sofia's analysis, asking thoughtful questions, and acknowledging areas where his own knowledge was limited. The other executives followed his lead, contributing their own insights and concerns. Sofia's recommendations were detailed and practical. For the portfolio issues, she outlined a specific strategy for reducing regulatory exposure while maintaining target returns. For the cultural issues, she proposed a series of initiatives designed to promote more inclusive decision-making and better utilization of diverse perspectives throughout the organization. By the time the meeting concluded, Wells had a new understanding of both the challenges facing Atlas Financial Group and his own role in creating those challenges. More importantly, he had learned something about the cost of assumptions and the value of humility. As the executives filed out of the conference room, Wells approached Sofia. Ms. Vasquez, I want to thank you for your patience today. I realize I didn't make a very good first impression. Sofia gathered her documents and returned them to her portfolio. Mr. Wells, first impressions can be misleading. What matters more is how people respond when they realize they've made a mistake. And how do you think I responded? Sofia considered this. Better than many would have. It's not easy to acknowledge when you're wrong, especially in front of colleagues. Wells nodded. I have a lot to think about. And a lot to learn, apparently. We all do, Sofia replied. That's what makes this work interesting. As Sofia left the Atlas building and stepped onto the busy street below, she reflected on the morning's events. The meeting had unfolded exactly as she had expected. Corporate executives were remarkably predictable in their responses to perceived challenges to their authority. But Wells's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and genuinely engage with her recommendations suggested that Atlas Financial Group might be capable of the kind of cultural change that Jonathan Atlas was seeking. The real test would come in the following weeks and months. Would Wells and his team actually implement the changes they had discussed, or would they revert to their old patterns once the immediate pressure was off? Sofia had seen both outcomes in her consulting career, and she knew that sustainable change required more than good intentions, it required sustained commitment and ongoing accountability. But for now, she was satisfied that the evaluation had served its purpose. Jonathan Atlas would have a clear picture of both the challenges and opportunities facing his leadership team. And perhaps more importantly, the leadership team itself now understood that their assumptions and behaviors had real consequences for the firm's success. As Sofia walked toward her next appointment, she made a mental note to follow up with Wells in a few weeks. Change was possible, but it required nurturing and support. If Atlas Financial Group was serious about addressing their cultural issues, they would need ongoing guidance and accountability. The eighth story, Sofia reflected, was often the one that changed everything. In this case, it might just save a billion-dollar firm from its own blind spots. 3 weeks later, Sofia returned to the Atlas Financial Group headquarters for a follow-up meeting. The reception she received was markedly different from her first visit. The security guard greeted her by name, the receptionist offered coffee, and Richard Wells personally escorted her to the conference room. We've implemented several of your recommendations, Wells reported as they walked. The portfolio diversification is already showing positive results, and we've started the cultural assessment process you suggested. Sofia nodded approvingly. How has the team responded to the changes? Better than I expected, Wells admitted. Once people understood that we were serious about valuing input from all levels, the quality of our strategic discussions improved significantly. And the regulatory exposure? Reduced by 60% as of last week. Your timing was perfect. The healthcare legislation passed committee yesterday with provisions that would have hit us hard under our old portfolio structure. Sofia smiled. Sometimes the eighth perspective is the one that sees what others miss. Wells paused at the conference room door. Ms. Vasquez, I've been thinking about something you said during our first meeting. About how good ideas can come from anywhere. I realize now that I've probably missed a lot of good ideas over the years because I wasn't listening to the right people. The important thing is that you're listening now, Sofia replied. As they entered the conference room, the same room where Wells had dismissed her input just 3 weeks earlier, Sofia was struck by how much had changed. The same executives were present, but the atmosphere was different. There was more discussion, more collaboration, and notably, several women and younger staff members had been added to the meeting. Ms. Vasquez, Jonathan Atlas himself stood to greet her. The CEO was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. I want to thank you for your excellent work. Your assessment has been invaluable. Thank you, Mr. Atlas. I'm pleased that the recommendations have been helpful. Atlas gestured toward the assembled executives. Richard has briefed me on the changes you've implemented. I'm particularly interested in the long-term cultural initiatives. Sofia opened her portfolio and withdrew a detailed report. Cultural change is a process, not an event. But the early indicators are promising. The leadership team has shown genuine commitment to examining their own assumptions and creating more inclusive decision-making processes. And the financial impact? Substantial, Sofia confirmed. The portfolio adjustments alone will save an estimated $2.3 billion in potential losses. But the cultural changes may have even greater long-term value. Atlas raised an eyebrow. How so? Inclusive organizations consistently outperform homogeneous ones, Sofia explained. They're more innovative, more adaptable, and better at identifying both opportunities and risks. The financial benefits compound over time. Wells leaned forward. Ms. Vasquez, I want to ask you something. When you first walked into this room, what were you expecting? Sofia considered the question. I was expecting exactly what happened. Corporate executives have predictable responses to perceived challenges to their authority, especially when those challenges come from people who don't fit their mental model of expertise. And you weren't angry when I dismissed your input? Disappointed, but not surprised, Sofia replied. The real question was whether you would be capable of recognizing the problem and adapting your approach. Atlas nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I wanted to assess. Richard, would you say this experience has changed how you approach leadership? Wells was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. Mr. Atlas, I realized that I had been leading from a position of insecurity rather than strength. I was so focused on maintaining my authority that I forgot that real authority comes from getting the best results, not from controlling the conversation. And now? Now I'm more interested in being right than in being in charge, Wells said. If someone has better information or a better idea, I want to hear it, regardless of where it comes from. Sofia made a note in her report. That's a significant shift in mindset. It suggests that the cultural changes will be sustainable. Atlas looked around the table at his executive team. Gentlemen, and ladies, he added, acknowledging the new faces in the room, I want to be clear about something. This assessment wasn't about punishment or blame. It was about ensuring that Atlas Financial Group continues to thrive in a changing marketplace. And what did you learn from the assessment? Thompson asked. That we had developed blind spots that were making us vulnerable, Atlas replied. Not just to regulatory changes, but to missing opportunities and underutilizing talent. Ms. Vasquez's evaluation showed us where we needed to improve. Sofia closed her notebook and looked around the room. The most important thing I observed during this process was that everyone here, without exception, wants Atlas to succeed. The question was whether the organizational culture was supporting that goal or hindering it. And your conclusion? That with relatively modest changes in approach, this team can be significantly more effective, Sofia said. The talent and expertise are already here. It just needed to be better utilized. Wells smiled wryly. In other words, we needed to get out of our own way. Essentially, yes. Atlas stood, signaling that the meeting was concluding. Ms. Vasquez, on behalf of Atlas Financial Group, I want to thank you for your professionalism, your expertise, and your patience. Your work here has been transformational. Thank you, Mr. Atlas. It's been a privilege to work with your team. As the meeting ended and the executives filed out, Wells approached Sofia one final time. Ms. Vasquez, I have one last question. Do you think I'm capable of sustaining these changes long-term? Sofia studied him thoughtfully. Mr. Wells, the fact that you're asking that question suggests that you are. Sustainable change requires ongoing self-reflection and humility. If you maintain that mindset, I believe you'll continue to grow as a leader. Thank you, Wells said, extending his hand. For everything. Sofia shook his hand firmly. The real test will be in the months and years ahead. Change is a choice you make every day, not just once. As Sofia left the Atlas building for the final time, she reflected on the complete transformation she had witnessed. What had begun as a textbook case of corporate arrogance and unconscious bias had evolved into a genuine commitment to cultural change and improved leadership. The eighth story, she thought, was indeed the one that changed everything. Sometimes it took an outsider's perspective to reveal what insiders couldn't see. Sometimes it took a moment of uncomfortable truth to spark genuine growth. 6 months later, Sofia received an email from Richard Wells. Atlas Financial Group had been named one of the best places to work by a major business publication, citing their inclusive culture and innovative decision-making processes. The firm had also outperformed industry benchmarks by 23%, thanks in part to their improved risk management and strategic flexibility. Your assessment changed more than our business practices, Wells wrote. It changed how we see ourselves and each other. Thank you for showing us that real leadership means being strong enough to admit when you're wrong and wise enough to listen when others are right. Sofia smiled as she read the message. Change was indeed possible, but it required courage, humility, and the wisdom to recognize that the most important lessons often came from the most unexpected teachers. The corporate world was full of Richard Wells, successful people who had risen to positions of authority but had lost sight of what true leadership meant. Some would never learn, too invested in their own image to acknowledge their limitations. But others, like Wells, were capable of growth when confronted with the consequences of their assumptions. As Sofia prepared for her next consulting assignment, she thought about the lessons of Atlas Financial Group. The meeting room confrontation had lasted only 2 hours, but its effects would ripple through the organization for years to come. One conversation had exposed systemic problems, challenged entrenched assumptions, and ultimately transformed an entire corporate culture. It was a reminder that change often began with small moments, a question asked, an assumption challenged, a different perspective offered. The eighth story wasn't always the loudest or the most obvious, but it was often the one that mattered most. Sofia closed her laptop and gathered her materials. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new assumptions to question, new transformations to facilitate. But today, she was satisfied knowing that somewhere in Manhattan, a group of executives was making better decisions because they had learned to listen to voices they had previously ignored. The lesson of Atlas Financial Group was simple but profound. In a world of constant change, the organizations that thrived were those that remained curious, humble, and open to learning from anyone who had something valuable to offer. Even, or especially, when that someone didn't look like what they expected expertise to look like. And sometimes, the most valuable insight came from the person they had been most tempted to dismiss. 1 year after Sofia's initial assessment, Atlas Financial Group had become a case study in successful organizational transformation. Business schools used their story to teach courses on leadership, cultural change, and the hidden costs of unconscious bias. Richard Wells had become a sought-after speaker on inclusive leadership, sharing his experience of being confronted with his own assumptions and the business benefits of changing his approach. His presentations were notable for their honesty and self-reflection, qualities that made him an effective advocate for cultural change in other organizations. "The most expensive mistake I ever made," he would tell audiences, "was assuming I knew who belonged in the room and who didn't. It almost cost my company billions of dollars and definitely cost us years of innovation and growth." Jonathan Atlas, meanwhile, had expanded Sofia's role within the organization, bringing her on as a permanent strategic advisor. Her mandate was to continue challenging assumptions, questioning conventional wisdom, and ensuring that the company's culture of intellectual humility remained strong. "Sofia taught us that real confidence comes from knowing what you don't know," Atlas explained to a business journalist. "The moment you stop learning is the moment you start declining." The financial impact of the cultural changes had been substantial. Atlas Financial Group's performance consistently outpaced industry averages, their employee satisfaction scores reached record highs, and their ability to identify and capitalize on emerging opportunities had made them a leader in adaptive strategy. But perhaps most importantly, the story had spread throughout the financial industry, inspiring other firms to examine their own cultures and leadership practices. The Atlas model became synonymous with the business case for inclusive leadership and the hidden costs of organizational arrogance. Sofia, for her part, had built a consulting practice focused specifically on helping organizations identify and address their blind spots. Her approach, which combined rigorous analysis with carefully designed real-world tests, had proven effective across industries and company sizes. "Every organization has its version of that conference room," she would explain to new clients. "The question is whether you're brave enough to find out what happens when someone unexpected walks in and challenges your assumptions." The story of Atlas Financial Group served as both cautionary tale and inspiration, demonstrating that even the most entrenched cultures could change when leaders had the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. And it all began with a simple question about risk assessment models, asked by someone who supposedly didn't belong in the room. The eighth story, indeed, was the one that changed everything. That if you enjoyed this story of corporate transformation and the power of questioning assumptions, make sure to subscribe for more incredible tales of change, growth, and the moments that reveal who we really are. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know about times when unexpected perspectives changed everything in your own experience.